Welcome and thank you for joining today's call, MTW Expansion Cohort Number 2, Applicant Feedback on Rent Reform Policies. Before we begin, please ensure you have opened the WebEx and participant chat panels by using the associated icons located at the bottom of your screen. If you are on the phone line, we do encourage that you join the webinar. Note that all audio connections are muted at this time to reduce background noise. If you require technical assistance, please send a chat to the event producer via the chat function in WebEx. With that, I'll turn the conference over to Marianne Nazaro, Director of Moving to Work. Please go ahead.
Great. Thank you, Michelle. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Cohort 2 webinar for the Moving to Work demonstration expansion. Again, my name is Marianne Nazaro, and with me today are Paul Joyce with the Office of Policy Development and Research and Allison Christensen from the Moving to Work office. We are thrilled to be here with you today, and we're thrilled to be moving forward with the MTW expansion. And I just want to acknowledge a very strong partnership and thank you to Paul and his colleagues in the Office of Policy Development and Research for their efforts in working with us on the expansion and putting together the webinar with you all today. We are thrilled with the level of interest that we received for Cohort 2, and Cohort 2 help us to build a body of research as it relates most importantly on how to establish rents for participants in the voucher and public housing programs here at HUD. Today is really a day for us to hear from you and to hear feedback from you all, people who expressed interest in the second cohort about the potential rent policies that we might be testing through the second cohort of the Moving to Work expansion. We've reviewed all of the letters of interest that we received for the Cohort 2, and we are considering possible updates to the potential rent policies for this cohort. After having reviewed the information provided by the applicants and also through this webinar and in your letters of interest, HUD will determine what the final rent policies will be, and we'll be noting those in the selection notice that will be published later this year. So they may be the same as what you've already seen in the letters of interest notice, and it might be updated based on what we heard from you today and through the letters of interest. We're hoping that today's webinar is interactive, and we've set aside a lot of time throughout the webinar to hear from you so that you can ask questions, provide comments, and participate through a live polling site. For the live polling, there are several organizations on the line. We ask that each organization vote only once so that we can make sure that we have an adequate representation. If there are others on your organization that you think that would benefit from the webinar, or if you'd like to review it again, we will make this webinar available on our website on the Cohort 2 section of the MTW website at www.hud.gov/MTW, and we expect it to be available by later next week. If you have any questions that we're not able to get to during today's webinar that you think about later, just feel free to send us an email at mtwcohort2@hud.gov, and then this email address is also available on the Cohort 2 section of the MTW website. And as always, we'll continue to update the MTW website with updates relating to the expansion and what to expect going forward. Now again, I'd like to introduce Paul Joyce from the Office of Policy Development and Research. He will be leading today's call, and so you're in very good hands with him. He's first going to go over the summary of what we heard from you all in the letters of interest that we received. He'll then describe a few points and possible changes that might be possible based on the rent policies and based on what we heard from you, and we'll be soliciting your feedback on that. And then, again, we really look forward to hearing from you. We hope that this is a good interactive dialogue, and so we look forward to hearing your thoughts and feedback. And with that, I would like to turn it over to Paul. Paul?
All right. Thank you, Marianne, and thanks, everyone, for joining today. We will have a couple dedicated portions of the meeting for questions and feedback. We could open up the phone lines at other points in time if needed. But if you have questions or comments in between the periods where the phone is open, feel free to send them in the chat in the WebEx. So the letter of interest notice, which I'll refer to as the LOI notice for shorthand, proposed 3 test rent policies, one tiered rent and two-stepped rent policies. I'm sure you're all familiar with those policies, or at least the one that you are most interested in. As Mary Ann said, we asked for feedback in the letters of interest, and we have been reviewing that and thinking about what we might want to change. Some of the letters of interest said that you would be happy to implement one of the HUD policies with no changes. Others offered some suggestions. We received, hold on, there we go, sorry. We received a total of 37 letters of interest from eligible PHAs. 8 of those PHAs have more than 6,000 total units. Now, across the entire MTW expansion, all of the cohorts, HUD can only select 3 agencies of that size. That restriction is in the expansion statute, so there's a lot of competition for those spots. As for the rent policies, 20 PHAs listed the tiered rent as their first preference, and 12 PHAs indicated that one of the stepped rents was their first preference, and that was evenly divided between the 5% FMR and the 3% FMR stepped rent. 5 PHAs indicated that their preference was to propose their own policy. So just to refresh your memory, here's how the tiered rent works. You would establish income bands of $2,500. Each household would be assigned to the tier that corresponds to their adjusted income. And within each tier, the tiered rent would be set to be affordable at the midpoint of the tier, and everybody in that tier would pay the same amount. Income reexaminations would happen every 3 years, so each household's tier assignment would last for 3 years, with exceptions only for hardships. Given the high level of interest in this tiered rent policy, we're not planning any significant changes to this policy. Now, to warm up and test the live polling functionality, we want to ask for your opinion on the tiered rent policy. And first, I want to make a few notes. For all of these live polling questions, we want to be clear that we're simply asking for your opinion. This is not in any way a commitment, and your responses will have absolutely no impact on your application. And as Mary Ann said, we ask for 1 response per PHA, and hopefully you're able to coordinate your colleagues on that. So if the person who submitted the letter of interest is participating, that person should probably answer, and if they're not, then try to designate one other person. Michelle, is the polling active? There you go. So you should see it on the right side of your screen, and the questions will also be here in the slides. So the first question is simply on a scale of 1 to 5. What do you think of the tiered rent policy as it was presented in the letter of interest notice? And please respond even if you don't expect or intend to implement the tiered rent. This poll is open for 30 seconds, which has just elapsed. Hopefully you were able to select a response and then click submit down at the bottom. Michelle, is that done, and now will the results display?
Yes, the results will display here in 1 second.
Okay, great. We have, unfortunately, a lot of no responses, but I assume everybody can see this. I see 13 people indicated that they like it, 1 person loves it, 1 person doesn't like it, and then there were 47 that didn't answer. Michelle, is there a way to run that question again just to see if it works, or maybe we open up the phone lines and see if people are having problems?
Let me check to see if we can run it again. And we can also, if anyone does have an issue or a problem, you can hit #2, or you can private chat with me, and I'll let you know how to access that poll. Okay, so it doesn't look like we can run it again at this moment. For those of you who did have issues accessing the poll, if you open your chat panel, There's a menu at the bottom of the WebEx, and there's a chat icon and a participants icon. And if you click on those, they'll appear to the right side of your screen. When the poll is launched, there'll be a little window that says polling, and it may be collapsed, so you have to click on the little caret, and it'll expand the polling window to the right. So let me see, if you want to continue, I can actually input this poll again, then we could run it again if you'd like.
Okay, we'll continue, and then when we get to the next section, hopefully it will work and more people will be able to respond, and we'll take it from there if not. Okay. So next we'll talk about the stepped rents, which there's really a lot more to talk about there. We're considering some substantial changes to the stepped rent policy. So the LOI notice presented two policies, both based on fair market rents. They involve the creation of a rent schedule based on unit size and FMR. Each household would be assigned to a step based on their income, so that we would ensure that each household starts the stepped rent at an appropriate level, and then after the first year, the rent will go up according to the schedule. I'm going to use some examples throughout my presentation, and for that I'll use Lexington, Kentucky, which is where I grew up, and it's also an MTW agency that has been participating in a different HUD rent reform demonstration. So here are the current FMRs for Lexington, and I'll use these two stepped rent tables. So this is the 5% FMR policy with Lexington's FMRs. There are 18 steps in increments of 5% of FMR. So for example, if there's a household with a voucher living in a two-bedroom unit, you would look at the two-bedroom column. Their adjusted income, this hypothetical household, is $29,000. So under Brook Rents, they would pay $725 a month. So that would be rounded down to the nearest step, which is $706. They would start at step 14, where the rent is $706, which is 80% of the two-bedroom FMR. The next year, they would advance to step 15, and their rent would increase to $751, and the maximum step in this policy equals 100% of FMR. The 3% FMR stepped rent policy is similar, but the steps, of course, are based on 3%. The step 1 rent is lower, and the final step equals 80% of FMR, allowing for a shallow subsidy. So that's a high-level overview, and Michelle, let's open up the second set of polling questions. We're going to have 3 questions here, so just to be clear, what you'll do is answer the questions and then click the Submit button down at the bottom. So the first question is simply, how well do you understand these two stepped rent policies from the LOI notice? And we want you to be candid. We want to know if they're too complicated. And then the second and third questions are simply, what's your opinion of these two policies? And again, please answer regardless of whether you intend to implement those policies or not. We want to know everyone's impression. And while we're waiting for those responses to come in, I just want to say hopefully this live polling works. There are a lot of people and a lot of organizations on the call, and so it's hard to get input from everybody. We certainly will have open the phone line, but we thought this would be a good way to get everybody's input. All right, Michelle, has the poll ended?
Yes, and let me just apply that. I'm still trying to help some people find the poll.
Yeah. All right, so what I'm seeing is 21 people understand, or 21 people or organizations understand the stepped rent policy very well. 14 understand it somewhat, only 1 not at all, and then still a lot of folks didn't answer The opinions of the policies are pretty balanced, really. There's about an even number of people who gave it a positive. For the second question, an even number gave it a positive assessment, like it or love it, as gave it a negative assessment. And for the 3% FMR policy, it's a little bit more positive. 16 like it or love it compared to 11 don't like it or hate it. So that's actually a little bit more favorable than I expected, particularly on the first question. We've been thinking a lot about these policies and reviewing the letters of interest, and some of the concerns that we've either heard or identified ourselves are that the several letters of interest expressed concern about how the stepped rents would impact tenants, and quite a few letters of interest said that the stepped rent policies were complicated, and having these big rent tables might be hard for tenants and PHA staff to grasp. Most of us don't think about things like steps. We just think about my rent is X many dollars. Another issue with these policies could be that the stepped rent schedules would need to be updated periodically. So if FMRs are going up in your jurisdiction, then when you update the table, the stepped rents would all go up. The entire table the numbers would change and go up. And so in those years when you update the table, the tenants could face a double rent increase, the rent step and another increase because the entire stepped rent table has increased. And then we got some questions about whether the rents should be based on FMRs or small area FMRs or payment standards. So we thought about these issues and have some ideas for potential improvements. First is that we could simplify the stepped rent policies if we simply get rid of the stepped rent table. This is the table I showed earlier for the 5% FMR stepped rent in Lexington. Instead, what we could do is just specify the size of the annual rent change. For the example I've been using, 5% of the two-bedroom FMR is $44. So if you live in a two-bedroom unit, your rent will go up by $44 a year. That's what you could tell your tenants. And this is essentially the same policy as the one portrayed in that large table. The only difference is that we're not talking about FMRs. It's a dollar amount that you can explain to your tenants, and we no longer have numbered steps, so there is no step 1 or step 18. So, Michelle, can we do the next question? This is just one question. Should we get rid of the big table and instead simply specify the annual rent change?
And just a reminder, if people are still having problems finding the poll, in the menu at the bottom of your screen, there's an icon with 3 dots with more options, and you can click on that and open the poll that way as well.
Thanks, Michelle. Maybe that will. I know when we were testing this out, I had a little trouble finding the polling myself. Just to be clear, everybody, this is, nothing about this call is definitive. So if you say get rid of it or don't get rid of it, that's not the end of the road. We still need to think about these issues a little bit more and discuss with HUD leadership. So.
And the results are being calculated.
All right. So we got 39 responses. 22 said get rid of the big table. 9 said keep it, and 8 were unsure. So that's okay. Pretty strongly in favor of getting rid of the table, but certainly not universal. All right. Next up. So in the LOI notice, these stepped rent tables were very precise. the change from one step to the next was exactly 5% of FMR or exactly 3% of FMR. So in the example I gave a couple slides back, the annual rent change for Lexington at 5% of FMR, that's actually $44.15 for a two-bedroom. Obviously, you would round that off to 44, and while you're at it, you might want to make the annual rent change an even number, so maybe knock it down to $40, and this is fine. I think HUD is happy to have some wiggle room on where the PHAs would set the rent increases, but how much wiggle room, we're not sure. So, Michelle, if you could open up the next question. What we'd like to do is see what you, the PHAs, might do if we gave you complete discretion. Imagine that it's entirely up to you to decide how large the change should be. Focus on a two-bedroom unit so that we're all thinking about the same thing. And the first question is, in dollars, approximately where do you think you would set the annual rent change? And then the second question is, I'd like you to try to translate that amount into a percentage of your fair market rent, because $100 doesn't mean the same thing in a high-cost market and a low-cost market. I apologize for asking you all to do math on the fly. All right, we are not getting a lot of answers. All right, there are 6 people who had no opinion. Most respondents said they would set the stepped rent between $1 and $40. A few between $41 and $80. Nobody wanted to set it higher than $81. In terms of FMR, most people picked less than 3%. Well, nobody picked greater than 5% of FMR. Equal numbers for less than 3%. I think we should take a pause here. And Michelle, can you open up the phone lines? I think we'd like to hear why folks aren't answering, make sure if there are technical difficulties or some other reason.
Sure. Please press #2 on your telephone keypad to enter the queue, and we will open your lines for comments and questions. I did have one from earlier. Your line is unmuted if you still have the question.
Hi, this is Portsmouth Redevelopment Housing Authority.
Yeah, we can hear you. Go ahead.
We like the tier rent because the tier rent is less work. Person income falls within that tier. You only got to do the research every 3 years, and it's less work and it's less chance for any errors. I'm only speaking because when I was in Champaign, we had a tier rent there, and that works very well because then it's less confusion, and it's easy for the tenants to understand and also for staff to understand, and it also eliminates errors in calculations.
Okay. So I should say, for PHAs that are interested in the tiered rent, we would still like you to answer the questions about the stepped rent just to get your perspective on these potential changes, if they would make you more interested in that policy. Michelle, are there other questions?
We do have another question. Your line's unmuted. Please go ahead.
This is Tanya Crowley from the Greenville Housing Authority. I didn't respond because I ran out of time. I probably would have selected 3 or 4. Either one I think is a good plan, and I agree with Mr. Bland that having it documented and charted out gives the families they'll know exactly what to look out for, and I definitely will welcome the option to streamline the processes.
Okay. Thanks. Michelle, if it's possible to increase the time limit for the rest of the questions, I think we should do that. I think
yes.
If there are any other burning questions, we can take them now. There are 2 other polling questions that relate to this, or sorry, just 1 other polling question related to this, and then we have some time for additional comments and questions. So let's go ahead to the next slide. We've also thought about whether the rent steps should be fixed for an extended period of time or updated frequently. Having the rent steps fixed for the entire study period, which for the Cohort 2 evaluation, we're looking at a 6-year study period. So you could potentially set the stepped rent, whether it's a schedule or just the annual rent change, and say this is what it's going to be for the next 6 years. Your rent will go up by $40 each year for the next 6 years. On the other hand, you might want to update the rent steps from year to year. Say you set the annual rent change around $40, but after 1 year there's a recession and you realize a lot of your tenants are struggling to keep up with the rent. You might prefer to update your policies so that the annual rent change is smaller. So the next question, Michelle, please open that, is whether your PHA would prefer to have the annual rent change fixed for the study period or updated as needed. It looks like you have 1 minute to respond here, so there is more time. Michelle can cut off the poll early if more responses come in, and it looks like we've heard from everyone. So as Michelle is wrapping up that question, we'll see the results on the right-hand side of the WebEx. We're going to pause at this point for maybe 5 minutes. We'll see how much time is needed and field any additional comments or questions about what we've discussed thus far. So please, what are the instructions, Michelle? #2 if you want to queue up with a question.
Yes, please press #2 if you'd like to ask a question on the phone. If you'd like to send in a chat question, please make sure you select all panelists from the To menu before sending your question.
Okay, great. And the responses are in. We got 20 people saying that they would prefer to reevaluate and update the rent steps each year. 15 said that they would prefer to keep it fixed for 6 years. So that's a fairly even split.
We do have a few questions on the phone.
Great.
Caller, your line's unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hi, this is Portsman again. A quick question. Although we submitted a letter for the percentage, the steps, can we change that to just the tier rent?
Your letters of interest were not binding. So when we put out the selection notice and you submit your full application, at that point you would indicate, well, the instructions will come out later, but I'll just say that what you submitted previously is not binding.
Okay, thank you.
Next caller, your line is unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hi, Tori Gonzalez from Houston, Texas. I think the challenge that I have with step rents is it more completely desegregates or delinks an income-based rent, especially once you start going down into year 5 or year 6. And the hardship provisions are critical to being able to make a step rent work, but then they also wind up having a lot more staff time related to handling hardships, where the tiered rents, you don't run into that situation. as much, and the underlying assumption of somebody's income is going to go up every year by either 3 or 5% year after year after year, I think is just not borne out in a lot of the research on low-income wage earners. And so I think it works well when there's no income and somebody's income is going up, but you take somebody who's already working full-time at minimum wage, and they're not seeing wage growth of 3 or 5% a year, year after year. And so I think those are kind of my general concerns with the STEP rent versus the tiered rent. Thank you.
Those are great comments, and a lot of that is queued up for the second half of this discussion. So thank you.
Next caller, your line is unmuted. Please go ahead.
Yes, when you were reviewing the how many were going to be selected out of each category, you said 3 out of the larger. Did you say how many were going to be selected out of the 20 that did the first tier?
No, I didn't say. So the MTW expansion statute tells HUD that we have to select we're limited in the numbers of PHAs that we can select in different size categories. So PHAs with more than 27,000 total units are not eligible at all. PHAs with more than 6,000 units but less than 27,000, we're only allowed to take 3 PHAs. That's what I was referring to. HUD has not made a decision about how many PHAs to select for each rent policy.
Okay, thank you.
Caller, your line is unmuted. Please go ahead.
Yeah, one of the issues that we considered in selecting was the concern about the impact on the number of people we can serve if things go wrong. So, if half expenditures as a result of a policy choice ends up, the half expenses go up, and then we have to serve fewer households. And so, is there going to be any consideration of that issue of, the number of vouchers utilized in relation to rent policy?
Okay, thank you. I'm sorry, was there a question there?
Yes. I mean, would there be any consideration in implementing the policy with respect to the impact on the number of households served, because picking one or other option could greatly increase HAP expenditures per person?
Right, I understand. Thank you for clarifying. Yeah, we at HUD have thought a lot about how to design these sample policies to balance that trade-off, that if the rents step up too fast, it will, or if the step rent increases are very large, then that puts a burden on tenants, but it is better for the PHA budget, whereas if the rents are you can imagine a flat rent. That separates tenant income from tenant rent, which is one key objective of the stepped rent. But a flat rent would stay constant over time. It wouldn't go up, and your PHA's budget might actually suffer for that. Your HAP expenditures might go up as people drop off the program and so on. And so that is something that HUD has thought about in designing these policies, and ultimately it will be up to each PHA to think about whether or not you think that policy will in fact work out well for you. Marianne, do you want to jump in on that one?
Yeah, and also just as that's a really good question, and thanks for kind of the evaluation as part of the answer, Paul. And just statutorily, MTW agencies are required to serve substantially the same number of families that they would otherwise serve absent the demonstration. And so in the operations notice that has published for comment a couple of times and will soon be released in its final format, the final operations notice will describe how HUD will be determining that substantially the same requirement is met.
Thanks, Marianne. All right, I think we should probably move on. We've got a couple more topics to cover, and then we'll have more discussion after I've gotten through all of that. So these are sort of more specific issues rather than what we talked about thus far, which would be sort of big picture changes to the stepped rents. The first issue is the measurement of income. The LOI notice uses the phrase prior year income in several locations, and in the letters of interest we didn't get much feedback on this, and we want to be sure that you understand what we're talking about. So typically when a PHA does a recertification, you measure a household's current income, the amount that they're making at that time and estimated for the upcoming year. HUD has another rent reform demonstration going on right now where PHAs are measuring income as the amount that a household made in the prior 12 months. One reason for this is that prior year income should be more accurate. Your staff don't need to guess what a family will make in the next year. You just report what they actually made in the prior year. Tools like EIV might also be more useful with prior year income. And another reason is that prior year income should be less vulnerable to manipulation. A second issue related to income is whether we should measure adjusted income or gross income. Of course, adjusted income is something you're all familiar with. It's what you do now with allowances and deductions factored into each household's income. We considered whether Cohort 2 might use gross income without any allowances or deductions. That might provide some simplification, but it would not affect income exclusions. It would lead to a slight increase in rent burden for most households, and it would be one more thing to change from the status quo. So in the LOI notice, we chose to use adjusted income, but we wanted to just check back to see whether you all had any thoughts on that. So Michelle, if you could open up the polling, we have two questions. First, what do you think of the idea of using prior year income? And second, what do you think of the idea of using gross income? The response options are the same for both questions. Michelle, are answers still coming in, or should we go ahead and close this?
Answers are still coming in.
Okay, great. Okay, I see the poll has ended. All right, so it looks like people are interested in prior year income. 25 respondents for that to 10 for sticking with current anticipated income, and a little bit of a closer even split on gross income versus adjusted. 17 would prefer to use gross income, and 15 would prefer to stick with adjusted income. All right, thank you. Okay, so now I want to talk about hardship provisions. Let me start by, of course, echoing the earlier sentiment that this is extremely important, with alternative rents reducing the connection between income and rent, we need hardship policies that protect tenants when they're set. And there are two basic reasons why a family might need a hardship. First, if their income goes down, and second, if their income is stagnant but their rent is increasing. So the LOI notice presented two hardships. The first is the full hardship, which applies to all policies and is meant to help families when their income goes down. And the second hardship is a limited hardship, which applies only for the stepped rents and is meant to help families when their rent goes up faster than their income. But we've recognized a few issues with these hardship policies. So when a family's income goes down, sometimes it stays lower for a long time, but often their income goes back up a year or two later. This is clear from HUD's administrative data in PIC. HUD-assisted households have very volatile incomes. It's not unusual for a household's income to go from $12,000 one year down to $6,000, then back up to $12,000, and then up to $16,000. So this household wouldn't need long-term rent relief. They just need it for that 1 year when their income drops to $6,000. But with the full hardship in the LOI notice, the benefit of receiving that hardship would be substantial and long-term. If you get the full hardship, your step is reset. That means every year from that point onward, you'll be at a lower trajectory, at a lower step than if you hadn't gotten the hardship. So this is not very well targeted for the income among HUD-assisted households. At the same time, and on the flip side, the limited hardship is probably not generous enough for some households because it's just a 1-year rent freeze. If you're already working, earning as much as you can, working full-time at the best job you can get, then a 1-year rent freeze doesn't do you much good under a stepped rent. It would just be a 1-year freeze, then the next year your rent would keep going up, but you can't increase your income, certainly not easily. And so that's a challenge. Ultimately, part of the problem here is that the policies in the LOI notice, the stepped rent in particular, is long-term. We're talking about long-term rent increases. And the full hardship is also long-term. And so part of the solution may be including a full triennial income reexamination as part of the stepped rents. In the LOI notice, we talk about the tiered rent having a triennial reexamination to set the rent. Under the stepped rents in the LOI notice, there would be a triennial reexamination, but it would only be used to verify eligibility, not to set the rent. We're considering whether the stepped rent triennial reexamination should also reset or re-benchmark each household's rent. So you could think of this as an opportunity to check in with each household and see how they're doing. So in years 2 and 3, families would face the scheduled stepped rent increases regardless of their income, but then at the end of the 3rd year, you do the triennial reexamination. If their income has increased and the stepped rent has worked well for them, perhaps you would just let them continue with the stepped rents, but if their income has gone down or hasn't changed, you could reset their rent based on their income at that time. So you would essentially have a stepped rent, but only within a 3-year window. And this would prevent long-term hardships due to continual step. So we want to know what you think of this idea, but hold your thoughts for just a second. Because triennial reexaminations would prevent long-term hardships, but if a family loses their job and their income drops to 0, they can't wait 3 years. So there needs to be a hardship policy for short-term challenges. And the goal of this policy should be temporary rent relief that's enough to get a family, give them enough time to recover or to get to the triennial reexamination. So what we have in mind is a hardship rent that would apply for 6 months. Under the tiered rent, if a family drops to a lower tier, they would pay the lower tiered rent for 6 months. In the stepped rent, if their rent burden exceeds 40%, they would pay 30% of income rent for 6 months. And then under both policies, after 6 months, the hardship rent would expire and they would go back to what they were paying, but the hardship rents could be renewed and the PHA would have some discretion there. So there is a balance. Evaluating these hardship requests would require work by the PHA. You'd have to check their income to determine whether they qualify. And the worst case scenario would be a family that requires a hardship and they have to come back every 6 months to renew that hardship rent. That would be a burden for them. And for the PHA, I do want to note that we have the other HUD rent reform demonstration that I've alluded to has a hardship policy that's very similar to this, and the average hardship lasts about 7 months. We don't seem to be seeing that repeat households coming back again and again. Can we open up the poll now? We have 3 questions about these 2 ideas together, the triennial reexamination, resetting the stepped rent, and the 6-month renewable hardship rent. The first question is whether you think that those hardship policies would provide adequate protection for tenants. The second question is whether you think that those policies would result in a reasonable level of administrative burden for you, for your PHA. And the third question is tying it all together, thinking about tenant protections, PHA burdens, and earnings incentives for tenants. Do you think that these ideas would represent a good balance of those objectives? I'll give you another minute or 2 to respond to that. All right, hopefully those responses are trickling in. As we wrap that up, I want to note that this is the end of my presentation. We've got the rest of the meeting for questions, comments, any discussion that you all want to have. And so we'll get these responses in and then open up the phone lines. All right. So general consensus is that these 2 ideas would be good for tenants. It's a little bit more mixed whether they would be reasonable in terms of PHA burden. That's understandable. That is a big challenge there. And then again, a mixed picture about whether or not they're a good idea overall. 12 people said that it would appropriately balance the different objectives. 13 said no. 9 weren't sure, and 33 didn't answer. Okay, so now let's open up the phone lines, and we'd love to hear any additional thoughts that folks have here. I want to just be clear that these are just some ideas that we're throwing out there. We want to hear if there's anything that we talk about in the polling or any opinions you didn't get to express.
As a reminder, please press pound 2 on your telephone keypad to ask a phone question. You may also submit a chat. And be sure to send your chat to all panelists. We do have a couple questions on the phone. Yep. Your line's unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hi. Quick question. On the hardship, it's much easier. I know you guys want to come up with something, but in my opinion, much easier to have the individual housing authorities come up with the hardship because they know their area better than you guys at the HUD headquarters. Each jurisdiction is totally different, and to come up with what I call a standard hardship that you're trying to create there, it may not fit all the housing authority you're bringing into the program. What worked for the first 39 was they was able to create the hardship based on their area, where now you want to do a hardship based on what you guys think, instead of allowing the housing authority to come up with a hardship policy that would benefit their particular jurisdiction.
Okay.
Next caller, please go ahead.
I would second that comment that I think a part of the challenge is one model and trying to accommodate the needs of the academics who want to study this and have it be exactly the same from housing authority to housing authority. I think any good hardship policy does include some flexibility and not just a one-size-fits-all hardship policy. And I think there's also, I mean, zero-income families, we treat those very differently than other hardships, and we do a 3-month hardship policy for zero renters, zero-income folks. So I think they're interesting questions, and you've got a challenge in front of you, but I think we do need to make sure that we have strong protections that will balance the burden of the housing authority and be able to be studied. So good luck.
Okay, thank you.
Hey, Paul, this is Allison over at HUD headquarters. We have some questions coming in through the chat. Maybe we could take a couple of those. The first is, how would any of these policies interact with FSS?
That is a very good question. I think that we're probably going to have to formally address that in the selection notice. So, Allison, I would be inclined to pump that back to you as to whether or not we want to comment on that now.
Yeah, I think that is going to be part of the selection notice, but that is a good thing to for us to consider.
I guess I can be candid that we probably would not be able to include current FSS participants in this study because of the escrow, because they already have a rent policy and an FSS participation agreement. But we'll follow up on that in writing.
Another question here, if the FMRs were to go down, would the rents go down as well? So could there be a household that, was paying more one year and then less in a subsequent year?
Under the policy presented in the LOI notice, that is the case. If you create your stepped rent schedule in 2020 and then in 2025 you're updating that schedule and the FMRs are lower in 2025 than they were in 2020, then all of the rents would decline.
If there's more questions on the phone, I guess we can kind of go back and forth to give everybody a chance.
Yeah, and thanks for calling my attention to the chat. I'll look through those as we go along.
There's another question on the phone. Caller, your line's unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hi, this is David. The confusion with that last question was combining the two things. The short-term hardship is a good idea, but the re-benchmarking every 3 years ends up, in my opinion, after thinking about it for exactly 30 seconds, defeating the purpose of the stepped rent, and it doesn't decouple it enough from income so that people who are trying to incentivize to get more and more income would actually be penalized at the end of the 3rd year when their rent jumped up to their newer income level.
So, sorry to interrupt you. You're absolutely right that there is a tension between the premise of a stepped rent, which is rents going up, and that being an incentive for tenants. But that said, we certainly haven't decided on anything, but you could do triennial examinations in a way that's similar to how interim reexaminations work right now, which is that if a household's income has gone up, you don't change the rent. If their income has gone down, you do change the rent. So if someone's on a stepped rent schedule and their income is going up, then they would just stay on that stepped rent schedule. But if their income has gone down, that's when you would reset their rent. That's one way that it could be implemented that would address part of your concern.
Yeah, definitely. And if that's in the notice, I think that would be helpful to clarify that.
So there were a couple questions in the chat about deductions for elderly and disabled, and maybe I'm not understanding because my attention is a little bit divided, but elderly and disabled households would not be included in this study, so I'm not seeing how that would be relevant. Are there other questions on the phone?
We can cover too. We're getting a lot of questions on the chat about when the final selection notice will be published and when we'll have these rent policies finalized. So just from the program office, we can say that the selection notice will not come out until the final operations notice is published by HUD, so that should be forthcoming. But once that happens, then you should see some additional, notices for the selection of agencies begin to be published.
And we expect that later this year, this 2019.
We have no more questions on the phone.
Okay. As a final note, let's see, I'll go to the official last slide. So the slides will be posted on the website. I want to reiterate what Mary Ann said at the top, which is that we have this, the MTW Cohort 2 at HUD.gov email box. We would love to hear additional thoughts about these possible changes. If there's something that wasn't entirely clear, please submit questions for us to consider, and then we'll think about these issues and present them to HUD leadership to finalize the policies that will be presented in the selection notice, and keep an eye on the website for updates. And that's all. Thank you, everyone, for joining today.
Great. Thank you so much, everybody. We really appreciated the feedback.
That concludes your conference. Thank you for using AT&T Event Conferencing Enhanced. You may now disconnect.